This video is going to take a look at functional groups. But before we can look at functional groups, we have to take a look at carbon and its importance in biochemistry and organic compounds. Carbon is often called the backbone of life in that it is the main element of organic compounds. Now, when we talk about organic compounds, we're talking about the class of compounds that contain carbon. There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, organic compounds means that they are primarily composed of carbon. Now, why carbon? Carbon, if we take a look at it, has 4 electrons in its valence shell. So it has a lot of options in terms of how many bonds and what types of bonds it can make. Single bonds, double bonds, triple bonds. Is it a linear structure? Is it a ring structure? Is it a branch structure? But there are lots of different forms of molecules that carbon can take, which makes it the backbone of life. Now, when we're looking at molecules that contain only carbon and hydrogen, we refer to those as hydrocarbons. Also, there are different ways that we're going to see molecules represented in this course. There are molecular formulas where you're going to see the elements with the subscripts representing how many atoms of each element. You're also going to see different structural formulas. So for example, we have glucose here. Notice the difference is in this case, the carbons are not drawn. That's because when we draw a bend, any bend like that indicates carbon. So oftentimes, we don't want to have to draw everything all out. It gets cumbersome. So just by drawing that bend, because carbon is the backbone of these molecules, we know that it has to be a carbon atom at that location. So you can choose to draw your structural formulas with the carbon or without, but either way is considered correct, and you will see both ways in this course. So functional groups, what are they? They are groups of atoms that are attached to those carbons that give molecules specific behaviors or properties, whether it makes them soluble, insoluble, prone to certain types of bonding or not. It's the functional groups that really change the behavior of those molecules and allow carbon to be the backbone and have so many different varieties of macro or large molecules. So when we take a look at the different molecules, we're going to see similar structures. We're always going to have a carbon, but then we're going to see these Rs. These Rs represent side chains. Most commonly, the Rs are other carbons that will continue on to another part of the molecule. However, they could sometimes represent hydrogens as well if it's the end of a molecule, but R just means it is bound to something else, most commonly a carbon. So when we look at a carbonyl, there's a carbon with a double bound oxygen. That carbon is also bound to 2 other atoms. So the carbonyl group makes a molecule polar, meaning that it is soluble in water. They're also known as aromatics and often commonly found in our lipids or our fats. Now, there are some varieties of carbonyls, depending what this R prime group. Now, this prime indicates that it's not necessarily identical to the other R. So if that R is actually a hydrogen, it is a carbonyl, but specifically it is an aldehyde. Aldehydes would look like this in a molecule, and an example would be ethanol. Now, in terms of what you need to be able to recognize, it's this diagram here. This molecule is showing you what it would look like as part of a larger molecule. Now, if that R group is just another carbon, so it's a carbon on both sides, we call that a ketone. So you'd have the carbon with a double bound oxygen, something like this, like an acetone. So carbonyl, I think of it as only one oxygen double bound to the carbon. Carboxyl, on the other hand, that carbon has 2 oxygens attached to it. One is double bound, one is actually a hydroxyl or an OH group. The carboxyl group would make that part of the molecule polar, and it has the ability to lose that hydrogen, making it acidic. Also, when it loses that hydrogen, it makes it negatively charged. This is commonly found in proteins. So if we take a look at acetic acid, the reason it is an acid is that hydrogen breaks off, and the ability to donate a proton or hydrogen ion is what an acid is. Hydroxyl is this OH attached to Again, an R is a carbon. This OH would make a molecule polar, is often found in our alcohols and in our carbohydrates. That's why we ferment carbohydrates to make things like whiskey and rye and beer or our alcohols. Common example is ethanol. You notice this part is just carbons and hydrogens, then we have the hydroxyl group here on the end, which clearly makes it polar due to the structural asymmetry. The amino group, classified by the nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. This will also make a molecule polar, meaning it will dissolve in water, or this portion of the molecule. It has the ability to gain hydrogens or hydrogen ions, meaning that it has the property of a base. When it gains a hydrogen, it becomes positively charged. So most often, molecules of amino groups are positively charged. This is also commonly found in proteins. So for example, we have ethylamine as a complex example, and we have ammonia as a very simple example. Phosphate. Phosphate group characterized by the phosphorus surrounded by oxygens. Key thing here with the phosphate is one oxygen is double bound, then there are 2 hydroxyl groups. It is linked onto the rest of the chain via or through an oxygen. Phosphates make molecules polar, or that part of the molecule polar, has the ability to lose those H's, making it acidic, making it positively charged. Phosphate groups we're going to see in DNA and ATP, our energy molecule of our cells. So when it has lost its hydrogens, it can also be drawn like this. So instead of seeing the full hydroxyl groups, you might just see the O negatives. So when you see ATP, you see 3 phosphate groups. That's where the triphosphate comes in of the TP. You can see it represented in a ball and stick model or drawn out structurally. Sulfhydryl, or a thiol bond, is indicated when you have a sulfur bound to a hydrogen and the rest of the chain, or the R, makes a molecule polar. Sulfhydryl has that traditional rotten egg smell found in amino acids and in CoA or coenzyme A, which we will see a lot later in this unit, but just remember that that's a key component that we'll talk about later. So when we see the sulfhydryl or this thiol, it's an addition sticking off the end, which makes that portion polar. Methyl, sometimes considered a functional group, sometimes not. I've included it. It doesn't often change the reactivity of a particular molecule, but we will often see it. It is carbon with 3 hydrogens bound to it, represented in either one of those 2 ways. It is nonpolar, and it is the least reactive of all of the functional groups. It is commonly seen in methane. So how do you go about identifying these functional groups? Well, the first thing you do is look for any oxygens. If there are no oxygens where you're looking, go to step 2. But if there is an oxygen, you go through these steps. If the oxygen is single bonded to a carbon, look for a hydrogen bound to it. Is it a hydroxyl? If not, there's no other single bonded oxygen that we are going to need to identify as a functional group. So then you look at it and go, is it a double bond? If it's a double bond to the carbon, right? If there are 2 oxygens, it's a carboxyl, right? 2 oxygens, carboxyl, but that oxygen has to be a hydroxyl. Now notice the carboxyl trumps hydroxyl. We don't look at that and say that's hydroxyl. That entire component is a carboxyl. If there's only 1 double bound oxygen and there's an H attached to that same carbon, it's an aldehyde. If there's an only double bound oxygen and that carbon is bound to 2 other carbons, it's a ketone. If there were no oxygens, we went to step 2, you'd look for the nitrogen and the amino. Otherwise, you'd look for the sulfur and the sulfhydryl, or you'd look for the phosphorus in the phosphate. So let's give a little practice here. What functional groups can you identify in molecule number 1? Correct, you have a methyl group. Down here in the CH3, there are no other function groups. What about molecule 2? Well, there are 2. You have the double bound oxygen. Remember, each bend represents a carbon. Double bound oxygen, that carbon is to 2 other carbons. It must be a carbonyl, specifically a ketone. There's another methyl. And lastly, in the molecule nicotine, we only have a methyl group. Keep practicing. That's the best way to identify them, is practice identifying them.